Hi and welcome. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. Great, thank you, Kate. I'll give it about one more minute for people to hop on. I know sometimes there's a little confusion about the time. We're on so many time zones. All right, so hello and welcome. I am Kim Klett, Deputy Executive Director for the Educators Institute for Human Rights. Founded by teachers for teachers, EIHR supports communities recovering from violent conflict. We do this by applying lessons from the Holocaust and other egregious violations of human rights, such as the Rwandan genocide, as a starting point for teaching secondary school students about how these conflicts evolve and how to prevent them. Today's program is the last in a series titled Journalism, Human Rights, and Education. At EIHR, we not only study human rights atrocities abroad, but also those here in the United States. Thus, we begin our webinars with the land acknowledgement. Today, I am in Gilbert, Arizona, on the land of the O'odham. We are presenting this acknowledgement in remembrance of the true Indigenous history of this land, in feeling the presence and diversity of Indigenous people today, and in stating our solidarity with Indigenous activists in reconstructing our vocabulary, honoring Indigenous cultures, and advocating for lasting reparation for Indigenous people, return of their land, past, present, and future. Learn more about the land you live on at native-land.ca. Excuse me. Today, I am thrilled to introduce Ron Haviv, whose work I have admired since I started studying the war and genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Ron Haviv is an Emmy-nominated and award-winning photojournalist and co-founder of the photo agency 7, dedicated to documenting conflict and raising human rights issues around the globe. He is also the co-founder of the nonprofit 7 Foundation, which concentrates on supporting documentary practice and education in media practice. His first photography book, Blood and Honey, a Balkan War Journal, was called, quote, one of the best nonfiction books of the year, end quote, by the Los Angeles Times, and quote, a chilling but vastly important record of a people's suffering, end quote, by Newsweek. His other monographs are Afghanistan, The Road to Kabul, Haiti, 12th of January, 2010, and The Lost Roles. Haviv has produced an unflinching record of the injustices of war, and his photography has had singular impact. His work in the Balkans, which spanned over a decade of conflict, was used as evidence to indict and convict war criminals at the International Tribunal in The Hague. President H.W. George Bush cited Haviv's chilling photographs documenting paramilitary violence in Panama as one of the reasons for the 1989 American intervention. Haviv is a central character in 6 documentary films, including National Geographic Explorer's Freelance in a World of Risk, in which he speaks about the dangers of combat photography, including his numerous detentions and close calls. He has provided expert analysis and commentary on ABC World News, BBC, CNN, NPR, MSNBC, NBC Nightly News, The New York Times, Washington Post, Good Morning America, and The Charlie Rose Show. And we hope that you will follow him on Twitter at Ron Haviv or on Instagram at Ron Haviv _ VII for 7. Excuse me. And I will be asking Ron questions as we go today. He's going to be using some of his photographs as we go, but please feel free in the chat box to drop questions that you have as we go. He's happy to answer. So Ron, I'm going to start with a big question. What made you gravitate toward war and conflict journalism?
First of all, let me just thank you, Kim, and thank you, Kate, for allowing this time for this interaction with teachers, which the concept of education is incredibly important and a partner in what I do as a photographer. I think we are working together for the same goals. And to kind of start off by answering your question, I'm going to kind of bring you back like more than 30 years ago when I kind of started as a photographer. And I went on my first foreign trip to cover an election being held by a dictator named General Manuel Noriega in Panama, who had lost support of the Americans. And he tried to hold elections. He lost the elections. He then beat or had his paramilitary supporters beat up the would-be winners in the streets. I managed to take a photograph of the vice president-elect covered in blood. He was being beaten and wound up on the cover of Time and Newsweek and US News and had some impact from there. And as you mentioned, was when the United States eventually invaded Panama. 7 months later, the President of the United States spoke about the photograph as one of the reasons or one of the justifications for the war. And it wasn't whether or not I agreed with the idea of the war. It was then when I saw that my photography could play a role in this process of information and helping people make decisions and so on, I thought this was kind of a really interesting way to spend my time. 1989, as many of you remember, the world was changing dramatically, and I was there to document the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I was in South Africa the following year photographing Nelson Mandela when he walked out of prison, and was in Kuwait City when it was liberated after the first Gulf War, and so on, because kind of documenting things and trying to have my view of the world seen by others. And then in 1991, I read about this place called Yugoslavia, and it was thought at the time as sort of the Soviet Union had fallen, and people thought that Yugoslavia was going to be one of the most successful countries transitioning to this quote unquote new world order. There was some talk about nationalism and this idea that perhaps Yugoslavia wasn't going to be as successful as people thought. And so off I went as Slovenia, which is the first part of Yugoslavia republic to declare their independence. And they had a very short war, less than a week. And I basically from 1991 through 2001 spent more than 5 years on the ground documenting all the different breakups and conflicts and what was going on, and starting to realize and understand the power of journalism and certainly photojournalism, and also the limitations of journalism, and beginning to spend the first real interaction with heavy conflict and what became later known as ethnic cleansing and so on, was working in the war in Croatia, which lasted about 6 months, being able to work on the Croatian side, on the Serbian side, and kind of documenting all the different things that were going on. And at the time, people were kind of amazed that there was a war happening again in Europe along some of the same battle lines as in World War II. And it was kind of really quite incredible. And as we kind of go through these photographs, we're also going to start seeing, or you should start seeing, some similarities to the work and imagery you're seeing that's coming out of Ukraine today, because it's almost interchangeable in some ways, both the war crimes that are occurring then and now, and as well as the kind of the ethnic cleansing that we were documenting. And in the beginning of the war in Croatia, especially for the American audience, nobody really cared. Nobody believed that the war was anything important. Nobody understood that this war in Croatia would lead to another war in Bosnia, which would then lead to another war in Kosovo, and so on, leading to thousands killed, millions becoming refugees. And it was this kind of continuous, like, uphill battle to try to get people to pay attention to what was going on in these photographs. And there was a town called Vukovar, which had been surrounded by Serbian forces. It was a Croatian town, and it was the longest city under siege since World War II. For 3 months, the people were living underground until finally here you see an example. These are Serbian paramilitaries. The day that Vukovar fell to Serbian forces, and the Croatians had to flee the town. And still, the world was not really understanding exactly what was going on in the former Yugoslavia. And you would have very unusual characters like this man here. This is a Serbian paramilitary leader known as Arkan, with his men. If you can't guess the name of the unit's called the Tigers. This is a little baby tiger that they quote unquote liberated from a Croatian zoo. And Arkan was responsible for a lot of the war crimes that occurred during the war in Croatia, and as well as a lot of the ethnic cleansing that occurred a few months later when the war in Bosnia started. And it was incredibly frustrating, I think, for myself and my colleagues, that the politicians and civilians outside of this little region of Europe were not really paying attention to what the war in Croatia meant. As bad as it was, it became pretty evident that if the war would start in Bosnia, it was going to be even more brutal. And in March of 1992, so a little bit more than 30 years ago, I wound up in a town called Bijeljina, which was a town just over the border in Bosnia from Serbia. And the town became split between Bosnian Muslims on one side and Bosnian Serbs on the other. And I documented kind of the fighting between the townspeople, the butcher shooting at the baker, the banker shooting at the bar owner, and so on. And something very similar that we had seen during Croatia, but very quickly the war escalated. And it escalated with the arrival of Arkan, the guy I showed you before, and his unit, the Tigers. And they came in and they said that they were there to cleanse the town of Muslim fundamentalists and free it for the Serbian people. And I asked Arkan if I could go with one of his units as they were going to go liberate the town, and he sent me off with a group of guys, and I went off with about 20 of the paramilitary soldiers to the center of town as they were looking for fighters, which they never found. They went into the mosque. They found a mosque in the center of town. They went into the mosque. They took down the Islamic flag. They replaced it with the Serbian flag. They posed for photographs with the flag. And then I heard some shouting, and I went into a different part of the mosque, and they had found this man, the man you see here, a Muslim, actually from Macedonia. His name is Harush Zabiri. He had been taking refuge in the mosque. They told me that he was a terrorist and that they were arresting him, and they had found some pistols somewhere in the mosque and said that they were his, which I don't believe that they were. And they arrested him and they kind of took him off. Shortly after that, I heard some more shouting outside. I walked outside of the mosque, and across the street, there was a house that was surrounded by a red wall. And it turns out that there had been a number of Bosnians that were hiding in the basement of this house. And they pulled out a middle-aged couple, Abdurraham Pajeti and his wife Haneta. And there's a lot of shouting going on. The soldiers were shouting at the Bosnian couple. The Bosnian couple was shouting back. They were shouting at me, the soldiers, not to take any photographs. And some shots rang out, and Abdurraham fell to the ground, and his wife tried to help him. Moments later, they brought out another woman, Tifa Shabanovic, who you see here lying against the wall. And then she was brought out and also shot. And so for me, I realized what I was witnessing was a war crime. Sadly, I felt that there was nothing that I could do to stop them from executing these people. They knew I was there. I was obviously there with them. And I realized I needed to be able to document this moment to make sure that there was evidence of this war crime to hold people accountable. So all I wanted to do was have a photograph of the victims with the perpetrators in the same frame. And as I went to lift the camera, this soldier, who's now been identified as Serjan Golubovich, sunglasses on his head, cigarette in one hand, kind of walked into the frame, and I was able to take this photograph. The photograph was then published in Time and Stern magazine in Germany and Paris Match in France and in many places. And this was done before the official start of the war, which is April 6th of 1992. And I thought that the publication of this work would be the photographic evidence that would push the world into intervening, which is what everybody was talking about at this point. There had been a referendum. The Bosnians had declared independence. The Serbs had said they weren't going to participate. So everything was pointing towards something very serious. And I thought, here, now, this is what this war is going to look like, and that there would be some sort of reaction. And there was no reaction. The war officially began. It lasted for almost 4 years. Thousands were killed, millions more became refugees, and led to another war in Kosovo. And basically today, Bosnia itself is a dysfunctional country. And the war began. This is April 6th, the day that the Bosnians in Sarajevo, the capital, had a peace march. They were still trying to hope that the war wouldn't start. And Serbian gunmen opened fire on the crowd as they were declaring their desire for peace. And as I continued to document, we started to discover more and more war crimes and atrocities and so on. By the summer of that year, through the work of Roy Gutman and Willemay, two journalists, they discovered that there were prison camps. I was one of the first photographers to get into the prison camps. This is a place called Manjača. And starting to, like, all of a sudden show the world what was going on. And still, there was very little reaction when you started looking at photographs that were very reminiscent of what we saw in World War II. The only difference now being that the photographs were in color. Sorry, it's a little bit unfair. These were camps. They weren't death camps, although people were being killed. There was no ovens and so on, but still 1990s, people are suffering, being executed and so on, simply because they were the opposite of the other side. So these camps held Bosnian Muslims and Bosnian Croats and were run by Bosnian Serbs. All sides had camps. We were only able to actually access the camps on the Serbian side. And the daily life, again, similar to what we're starting to see today from Ukraine, funerals and all sorts of different things kind of coming on our screens, in the papers, on television, so on. While every day we, as journalists, were reporting and hoping that there would be some sort of impact. And it really wasn't until 1995, so more than 3 years after the war started, the United Nations named a number of different towns as safe havens. And one town called Srebrenica was one of the main safe havens. There was a UN base there. And the Bosnian Serbs decided to attack that safe haven and to clear it of Bosnian Muslims. And basically what they did was they took all the women and children, they put them on buses and they sent them to Bosnia. And the men tried to escape. And any man that was basically over the age of 14 and under the age of 60 something, many of these men were found, men and boys were found, and they were killed. And in the end, over 8,000 men and boys were killed. And this part of the war in Bosnia was one of the parts of the war that was named a genocide. And here, this woman has just arrived to the United Nations. She's lost her son, she's lost her husband, and she's expressing her outrage and frustration at this Swedish UN soldier. And there was a group of women sort of just sitting together, literally in shock. And I went up to them and I said, do you know where your men are? And everybody, as you can see, just started crying. And you see here, there's a young boy and an old man and another young boy, and there are no men in this photograph. And most of them were killed. And now every July in Srebrenica, and they've been doing this since the war ended, they're finding remains of people, identifying them through DNA, finding them in mass graves in the woods and so on. And there's a mass burial service every year. And they still are looking for hundreds more people that are still looking for their remains of the hundreds of people that are still missing from those conflicts. And so kind of the daily life kind of continuing and so on, and leading into other conflicts, leading to the war in Kosovo. This is a photograph of the remains of a Kosovar who was burned by Serbian forces, a group of people that were killed in a town called Mea. And it kind of just kept repeating itself over and over again. This child died of exposure as he was taking refuge in the mountains as Serb forces were coming through the area. And people, of course, fleeing for their lives. Again, very reminiscent of the photographs that you're seeing today from Ukraine. And then this last photograph from the Balkans, I think, is probably the most representative, not only of the Balkans, but of Ukraine, of Iraq, Rohingya, Syria, everywhere. It's this idea of the other, right? People that are different than us. They are obviously the enemy. They are going to come and kill us, so we need to come and kill them before, because they are different. And so this is a family photograph of the Fako family, a Bosnian Muslim family who lived in a suburb of Alija, of Sarajevo. And they fled at the beginning of the war. The Dayton Peace Agreement reunified the city, and they went home to their house. Everything was gone. Electricity, furniture, pipes, it was basically a shell of a house. And the only thing left in the house, lying on the floor, was this family photograph that we assume was left by the Serbian family that had been living there during the conflict. And you can see here, like through probably a razor blade, etching out the face, the drill bit kind of crossing them out. This is eradication of the identity of the other person. So it's just a photograph of a photograph, but I think probably is one of the most powerful photographs that I've taken. I don't know, Kim, if you had some questions on that.
Yeah, and again, folks on the call, please feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat box. But yeah, I definitely, we have a lot of teachers on this webinar today. And so I wanted to go back to the Seven Foundation and the book and the exhibit that's coming up at USIP. I have the book here.
Great, thank you.
Imagine Reflections on Peace. And the question, EIHR wrote lessons, and I'll put that link in the chat box in just a minute, but the question of ethics in photojournalism arises. And so I know when teachers ask students to consider the choices that photographers make when deciding to take a picture, whether it's during, a tense or highly emotional moment, or, the picture of the infant that you showed. What's your thought process? I know you mentioned that, thinking about, okay, I'm going to use this picture as testimony, yourself as a witness, but what else kind of goes through your mind as you photograph these really tense moments?
Well, I think it depends on the situation. In situations where it's life and death, one of the things is, and every photographer or journalist has their own rule, and I don't think there's any way to judge whether it's right or wrong, because being in those situations is incredibly difficult. But for me, my rule is, if there's something that I can do to help, if I'm the only one there, or if I can intervene and survive, then that's what I do. The camera goes down, and I'm a human being first, I'm a photographer second. If there's nothing that I can do to stop something, to affect something for the positive, or if there are people there to help victims or so on, then my job is to be your eyes. My job is your representative, as the one to communicate. So then I'm going to do my job, and I'm going to take photographs. I would say that one of the things often that photographers are criticized at is, especially in, let's say, a funeral, very emotional moments. You saw early on, I showed you a photograph of a young boy crying. That was at his father's funeral. And people say, how can you intrude on a moment that's so personal and so delicate and so on? And in my beginning as a photographer, I remember being at a house where they were preparing a body for burial. Somebody that had been killed due to the conflict. And I didn't want to intrude. I wanted to let people have their space and so on. And somebody came out of the house, physically grabbed me, dragged me into the room where people were mourning over the body, and said, photograph this. Tell the world what has happened. Now, this is not going to a hospital, somebody that just died from a heart attack and all of a sudden appearing, in a grieving family with a camera. In these situations, political situations, conflict situations, people are very aware of the image. They're aware of the sacrifice, and they want their loved one to be documented so that there's some record, some like this person died for a cause, or this is what happened, and so on, for there to be some sort of impact. So the photograph of the child crying at the funeral, I didn't find out until after the war, when I had an exhibition, and that child came to the exhibition and said, when that photograph was published, people sent him money, sent him to school, took care of him for his entire life. There's just one small impact of that picture. And he said, thank you for honoring the loss of my father, who was a policeman killed in an ambush, and then also all these different things that happened with the photograph. And the power of photography is quite incredible. So I'm doing this documentary called Biography of a Photo, co-directing it with another educator, Dr. Lauren Walsh. She's a professor at NYU. And we're looking at the photograph from Panama that I described and the photograph from Bosnia of the victims, and looking at what impact those photographs had, basically doing a biography of from the moment the photograph was taken, and then all the different impacts over the last 30 years that those photographs have had, from foreign policy to education to culture to affecting individuals and how they made decisions to go forward and so on. And it really is incredible. It doesn't happen with all photography or all photographs, but in the history of photography, there have been times when photographs have really gone on to live these different lives. And that's when they become under the definition of iconic imagery. When they leave their world of, in this case, the world of journalism, and become active in other ways. So one of the things that we did here with Imagine Reflections on Peace is that Gary Knight, who created this project, who's also the co-founder with me of the Seven Foundation, that we decided to send writers and photographers back to countries that they documented at war to define what peace is today. And each country is different, and each country is at a different stage. And in fact, actually, we just opened up an exhibition in Sarajevo at the National Museum, where we brought it to current events, where we include even imagery from Ukraine, because Samantha Power, who's now the former UN ambassador, is now the head of the USAID. She writes in the book, in her afterword, about the impact on peace of the diaspora and of refugees and so on. But we also talk and show in the exhibition Afghanistan, and in the book we have Syria and Iraq, who are sort of, especially Iraq, in this kind of tenuous place of peace, as well as Colombia, where we also, I was just in Colombia 2 weeks ago, where we opened the Spanish edition of this book. And this book was created to not to be a rule book, but to be a handy book of information about how did Northern Ireland succeed, what mistakes did they make, how did Rwanda succeed, what made them different than others. So for instance, Rwanda, while you can say they're in a sort of quasi dictatorship with only one leader, Kagame, since the genocide, they've succeeded in many other ways. And one of the differences between Rwanda and, let's say, Bosnia is that over 60% of the people in government are women. And in many of these countries, women have no role in both, obviously, the lead up to war, but also in the aftermath of peace. And so through these different pieces in the book, which more importantly include many local voices, it's not just the observers speaking. While there's a lot of photography in it, the book has much more text from the, for instance, in Bosnia, we have a Bosnian politician, a journalist turned politician. We also have one of the prisoners in the photograph that I showed writing about his experiences as a prisoner and then as a refugee. Or we have a filmmaker speaking, and so on. So we have all these different voices coming together, as well as the people who negotiated the peace treaties in Northern Ireland, or gave advice for other places, and how different peace agreements learn from each other. So this is just some of the work of mine, and my piece is about Bosnia, obviously. And this woman here you see on the right is the same woman that you saw with the UN soldier. And here she is now in 2018, when General Ratko Mladic, who was the Serbian general who was basically, she's here celebrating the moment that the verdict came down at The Hague in the tribunal. So some of the things, a lot of these places kind of like these sort of full kind of circle things. And as said in the chat, we're opening up at the USIP in Washington. So if you're there over the summer, please come to the exhibition, because it's one thing to look at it on your laptop or your phone or even in the book, but to experience it in person is a whole different, I think, interaction.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. And it's so interesting getting the backstory. I didn't make the connection of that being the same woman in that photograph. Yeah. That's incredible to hear. And you had mentioned earlier about the connections that we're seeing between what happened in Bosnia, and again, saying that we can't believe this is happening on European soil, to what's happening in Ukraine today. And you know, looking at the photographs that you made of President Zelensky and the atrocities being committed there, I just felt that you captured everything. You captured, first of all, everything that the president was going through or must be going through, from worry and stress to sadness to even moments of joyfulness. So I wondered, first of all, what was it like photographing him? And can you share your thoughts on what you saw in Ukraine?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I arrived in Ukraine about a week and a half before the official start of the war, to a place that on one hand was gearing up for a possible fight, where here civilians were being taught with sticks and eventually would be given guns and so on, being taught in the woods and taking it seriously, but not really taking it seriously. So the evening of February 23rd, the night before the war started, I was in a great restaurant having borscht with lots of Ukrainians who were all enjoying themselves, with really no belief that the Russians were actually going to invade, or if they were going to invade, it would be some limited movement in the east, far away from the capital, and so on. And so the next day, their world changed. The world changed itself, obviously, and the war began, and began in a way that many people didn't experience. And some of the similarities between the Bosnian War and the Ukrainian War was that when the war in Bosnia started, experts, pundits, intelligence, and so on, all said the war would be over within a week. The Bosnians would lose very quickly, and that was fine, and everybody could deal with sort of the aftermath. Nobody expected the war to last for 4 years. I mean, some people did, but most people didn't. And very similar to Ukraine, if you remember conversations in January and February, Russians will attack, the capital will fall, the war will be over, and we'll see what happens after that. And the Ukrainians did an amazing job, especially in the beginning, when they were trained by NATO, trained by Americans and so on, but people still didn't expect them to fight as well as they did, and they certainly didn't expect the Russians to fight as poorly as they did. So the capital started to be attacked. Territory was lost in some places. Territory was defended in others. Civilians started to bear the brunt of the conflict. And to some extent, this man, Zelensky, became the symbol. And I have photographed many presidents and Nelson Mandela and other people of sort of the Mandela quality of person, people that have risen to meet a challenge. And Zelensky, in my mind, very much was, he was an actor, he was a comedic actor. Nobody expected much from him. And he and his government it's just quite incredible what they've been able to do. And being able to spend a couple of hours with him in his office and so on while he was doing an interview. And so it was just really, you felt a different energy and something special from him, which I thought was pretty remarkable. And it's still, of course, it's not over. I mean, things can change. At this point, people don't think a lot will change, that I think it will start to become a little bit of a stalemate. And the question will be like, when does this conflict end? When does it sort of basically, going back to this idea of ethnic cleansing that I was documenting in the former Yugoslavia, myself and my colleagues were documenting this day in and day out. People getting on trains. Here, this woman, Alona, her husband is right in front of me. She's saying goodbye to him. He has to stay behind because men under the age of 60 are not allowed to leave Ukraine. So families were being separated voluntarily in some places, and often in other places not voluntarily. Like here, these people are escaping from Bucha and near Pin. Every day, hundreds of people were leaving. They were fleeing war crimes that were being committed, whether it was in the snow or elsewhere. This kind of continuous movement of people. And again, as I mentioned earlier, like people not knowing if they are going to be able to return home. And speaking to people, like, what did you bring? I brought my cat, I brought my dog, I brought my child, I brought my mother. Older people were being taken out in wheelbarrows and taken out on stretchers and so on. And these people are just beginning their journey. They've left Irpin and Bucha, which towns you might have heard of, where a lot of the war crimes were being committed while Russians were occupying it. And they were being here, they had to survive crossing a broken bridge. And there was sniper fire and mortar fire in this area. And then they would get to Kyiv, and then in Kyiv, they would decide, do I become a refugee and go to Poland? Do I go to Romania, Moldova, and so on? Or do I stay displaced and so on? And it's kind of continuous thing. These are, again, sort of scenes that witnessing, as you saw earlier, from the war in Croatia, the war in Bosnia, or, from World War II. These are, again, also the same lines. There was the Irpin River, which is the bridge that they're trying to cross, was a front line in World War II. So it's sort of this historical repetition, which is, just absolutely, incredible.
And I think that, with these photographs that you've captured, and like you said, we don't know how long this is going to go on. And we know that the general public has only so long of an attention span, and that, that fatigue arises around these incidents. So I think your work is even more important of capturing those moments that speak to, to the public, and maybe add to that sympathy and wanting to care.
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the things that I think that people, obviously nobody knows exactly what Vladimir Putin is thinking, but it is logical to think that since he's not being affected by the losses at the moment, they're surviving, the Russians seem to be surviving the economic sanctions for the moment, that he thinks, especially with the United States, that $6 gas will become a bigger deal. And while it was fine in February and March, I want to go take my family on a vacation in July, and I can't afford to. And part of it is because of Ukraine. Support will start to break apart. Obviously, the United States, there's an election coming up in November. So the question will be, and my job is, as long as this goes on, and the jobs of my colleagues is that we tell the story and remind you, and it'll be up to you as the voter, up to you as whether the voter here or in the UK or Europe or wherever, where do you draw the line, and do you feel like it's still worthwhile to make a sacrifice? And that's, I think, that is one of the fears that the Ukrainians have, is that people will it's amazing how long this has lasted at top of the news. But as we saw here in the United States, the abortion conversation took over for a while. The election will take over for a while, and then whatever else, shooting in Buffalo took over. And slowly people will forget that people are still going through these experiences in Ukraine. To this end, so far, the Biden administration has really stepped up, probably more than almost every other government, if not every other government in the world. And we'll have to see. But when you have images like this, which is just a war crime of a man that was shot, his hands have been tied behind his back. This is from Bucha. You can go to the New York Times. They've done an amazing job in the last few days about speaking about this man and others. This whole group of men was a big story in the New York Times, I think yesterday or the day before, basically going through what happened to them. We are trying to make sure that people are remembering. I mean, this is incredible. Like, this man in the foreground was shot and then decapitated by Russians who have already been identified through social media. The survivors of this particular massacre they already know the names, where the people live, and so on. This war has changed, especially in terms of visuals and evidence and so on. Has changed the way things work so dramatically. It's really quite quite amazing.
And yeah, because again, there are so many teachers on the call, I just wanted to remind again, Ron and I were talking before we started about the importance of using photographs in the classroom and making our students aware that they do have that power, like Ron was saying, to vote and to, make sure that these issues are being taken care of the way we want them to, and that attention is paid to those.
Yeah.
And so, Ron, I wanted to ask you another question about, you don't just photograph conflict in war zones, but you've also found ways to help and to give back in many of the areas where you've traveled. And definitely you have this interest in justice and human rights. So could you tell us more about that?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I think the biggest thing that we've done is the creation of the Seven Foundation that Gary Knight and I have created. So the foundation has two purposes. One is to create projects like Imagine, to be able projects that cannot be funded by traditional media and so on, and then distribute that through media, exhibitions, conversations like the ones we're having, and so on. And the other part of the mission statement of the foundation is the Seven Academy, which purpose is to educate majority world students in visual journalism free of charge. And we've been doing that for a little bit more than 2 years now. We have a base in Sarajevo where we teach all the students from the Balkans, not only from Bosnia, but from Serbia and Croatia, Turkey, Romania, Greece, and elsewhere. And we're opening up a school, a physical building in Arles in the south of France, which will open up this summer, which will start, COVID dependent, of course, start teaching students in person. And we've taught over 700 students for free so far. And so that will only continue. And so that's one of our kind of biggest impacts on the conversation of journalism today, and also on the future of visual journalism going forward. But also I work on different projects with different organizations. So one project is called River of Gold, which is a documentary film documenting myself and another writer going back to the Amazon in Peru to expose illegal gold mining. And we were able to go to places like this, which was 25 years ago, this was all rainforest. And then due to illegal gold mining, it looks like this. And so the project, which is now, the first step was the documentary, which was shown at COPA to government officials from around the world, the environmental conference, resulted in putting pressure on the Peruvian government to shut down a lot of the illegal gold mining. And now it's part of a campaign very similar to blood diamonds, like where do your diamonds come from? The same conversation now is where does your gold come from? Like your gold ring, do you know where it came from? Is it from the Congo? Is it from Peru? Is it sourced legally and so on? And very much so, again, with this idea about using visuals to help people identify their role in the world. What can they do? Well, what you can do is when you next time you go to buy at Pandora or other places, ask them where's the gold from? And if they can't answer that question, then maybe you shouldn't buy it. And the more pressure that we put on the producers of jewelry, for instance, then the more the chain will become more beneficial to the people working. And also, obviously, in this case, the Amazon, which produces a huge amount of the air that we breathe in the world, is very much like what you're wearing on your ring actually has an impact on how we're going to survive as a race, as a civilization going forward. And then another project I did, and this is just a couple out of many, was a project with UNICEF on the state of children in Darfur, which has been lately the conflict has simmered down to some degree, but basically a genocide was declared by the United States in Darfur and so on. And this is, again, one of the things that visual journalism can do, which I hope many of you understand when you're using imagery in your curriculum, is that it's one thing to say 500,000 people have been killed in Darfur. It's a number that is, you can't even register that number as a human being. It doesn't make any sense. But when you identify with this young girl who's displaced, where she and her, not siblings, but her two friends, I found them in the middle of the desert. They had left their camp to go out to find firewood to be able to cook food at the camp. And the reason that she's about 12 years old here, the reason that she's going out into the camp and not her father is because if her father is caught by the enemy, the Janjaweed, at the time, sort of the nomadic Arab tribes, if they're killed, father interacts with them, he'll probably be killed. If the mother interacts with them, she'll most likely be raped and possibly killed. So they send out the children in the hope that they're too young to be raped or to be killed, although there, of course, have been cases of young children being raped. So this idea of like trying to use visual journalism to have an impact. And this exhibition was then held at the United Nations. This print was sold, the money being given to UNICEF to support people like her and so on. So there's all these different kind of roles that visual journalism can play.
And I feel like these projects must really, kind of keep you going because it's such a dark topic oftentimes. But I'm wondering, is there any place that you've been that had more of an impact on you? And if so, why that place and what about it?
Well, I think probably for me, I've been doing this for about 35 years now, and probably having worked in the breakup of the former Yugoslavia over a 10-year period where I've spent the most time on the ground and saw both the power of visual journalism as well as the limitations probably has affected me the most. But I would say probably that now Ukraine, given that it is Russia who is one side of it, and almost to the extent that we are in a proxy war now between NATO and Russia, Ukraine is probably, and I was in Iraq, I was in Afghanistan, I was in Libya and Egypt for Arab Spring and so on, huge stories with incredible impact on millions of people. But this story now, and we'll obviously have to see how it ends, is probably one of the most important stories to document, given the role of all the different players and so on.
Yeah, definitely. And we have a question in the chat box about any advice that you might have for teachers with younger students who would be interested in photojournalism, grades like 7 through 12.
Well, we live in a time when there is so much availability of amazing work to show to students. And there are already curriculums that are connected to using photojournalism as the main sort of teaching tool, but also for people that are interested now, that most likely I would assume that pretty much everybody from grade 7 through 12 has a phone. So everybody has a camera, right? So now you don't have to really worry about budgets for cameras or dark rooms and so on. While that would be great, sort of teaching photojournalism in a traditional way, there are great ways to look at photography in a different way, and to teach them about how they had the phone. The phones are great quality and so on. So there's another project that I'm involved with, which I didn't talk about here, called Lost Roles America. And Lost Roles America is about people, if you have physical film that you found in a drawer or your parents never developed when they were kids, you can send that in to us and we'll develop it and scan it for free. And then you could write about the impact of seeing this sort of lost memory. But connected to Lost Roles America is two curriculums. One about for parents and kids, and another one about photography. And you can go to generationhumanrights.org and download for free the curriculum about Lost Roles America, using how to, and it also talks about teaching photography to grades 7 through 12.
Great, that's really helpful. And I wonder, like you said, every kid pretty much has a cell phone nowadays. And so I wonder too, we used to print the photographs and stick them in an album or something. What about all those photos that are on our phones that get lost as well?
Exactly, and the curriculum deals with exactly that concept and so on. And I think it's also, especially for those of you that have minority students, especially like African American, Latino students and so on, that it's important to show them there's amazing African American photographers working today, Latino photographers, photographing their own communities and so on. This is not something simply like just for white men, which it was for a very long time. But now there are many amazing women, colleagues of mine from different nationalities, different races and so on. And this idea that photography allows you, and it certainly does not have to be conflict related at all, but the idea of photojournalism is documenting what's around you, documenting what you're passionate about, telling stories that are important to you. Those are things that you have as a teacher can create your own curriculum, or there's curriculum available to help your students go learn about their lives. And I think it's really incredibly important. Just one last thing, like one of the things that we're doing, we're partnering with the YMCA in Boston, and we're teaching inner city kids from Boston photography at the foundation. We have a program with the Y, so we're hoping also to expand that beyond Boston. And that's grades 7 through 12. Yeah.
Nice, thank you. I'll ask one last question, unless somebody else has one that you want to put in the chat box. I'm happy to address those. But thinking about the book, and I just absolutely love this. I'm excited to see the exhibit this summer at USIP. But I'm just wondering, the book is such a great resource, I think, for teachers, for anybody who just wants to learn more about these conflicts and genocides. But how difficult was it, in the editing process of deciding which photographs and which stories to feature? Because you're right, they tell the whole story, but in a very brief manner, succinct maybe is a better word. How difficult was that process?
I think it was a tough process. Fiona Turner, who was sort of the managing editor of the whole project, kind of going through everything, and I think trying to see from each side, each piece, each country, kind of key lessons that worked, successes, but also I think failures were also really important. I think very much in this idea of trying to have these little bits of information that maybe the hope is that in the next place, Ukraine, let's say, will hopefully be very soon negotiating for peace, that there'll be pieces in this book, lessons or quotes or statements or thoughts that come from Rwanda or come from Lebanon or so on. Like, what did they do when they were brought up to like kind of this wall? They hit this wall, and how did they get past it? And how do they get to a point of success. And so I think we were really very conscientious about trying to be hopeful without question, optimistic, but also be realistic about the limitations, and also to acknowledge, using Bosnia for an example, Dayton Peace Agreement was only supposed to be there for a short time. 30 years later, no, so not less than 30, 20 some odd years later after the end of the war, it is still the structure that's governing the country, but it was never intended to do that. So the hope is, like Colombia as they move forward, or Afghanistan as they move forward, that they won't limit themselves to what was established just to stop the shooting, but to try to find an all-encompassing way to involve as many different parts of society, specifically, obviously, those people that were against each other, to find a common road going forward to be successful.
Absolutely. And I think I said that was my last question, but I have one more. Thinking about your photographs, and again, I would put everything that you've done, that I've seen at least, that you're showing this, again, kind of like in the book, this well-rounded picture of what occurred, and that sometimes includes these very joyful moments. And I guess maybe it's more a comment, but I'm just so appreciative of those, because I think we need to show that in the classroom as well, not to sugarcoat it, but just to show that, yes, even in a war, even in a conflict, life goes on, and you find these moments of joy and happiness. And like, I was thinking of the one in Ukraine that you took of the wedding, right? And showing those moments. And I don't know if you want to comment on anything with that, but I just find it really interesting.
No, I think it's absolutely important. I think it's important to that the people are trying to maintain a life. They're trying to say that our life has to go on, marriage and going to the hairdresser and so on, as much normality as possible given different situations. It is part of the resiliency of all sides when they're in a conflict. And I think it is also important for us as the viewer, because those are things that we can relate to. It's very hard to relate to a scene of a war crime. It's not a normal thing that we see, but a couple getting married, people shopping, couple kissing, things like that. Those are things that we, as an audience, as a viewer, as a human beings, can appreciate. And then when you can appreciate that, you become much more connected to. You have a connection to them, and then when you also see them suffering, it also affects you, I think, on a little bit of a deeper manner.
Absolutely. Well, Ron, I want to thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure and amazing experience for myself, and I'm sure for everybody on the call. And again, I would encourage, if anybody is in Washington, D.C. this summer, it's through August 1st. The exhibit, Imagine Reflections on Peace, is up at USIP. And I put the link in the chat box earlier. We also have lessons that go with whether you use the online version of the exhibit or see it in person or use the book. We have lessons for that EIHR has written, and we would love for you to look at those and possibly use them in your classroom. So Ron, thank you again. We so appreciate your time and your work with everything that you've done.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, and this will be is recorded. So if anybody, I know some people came in late, we will have that available for you. Thanks, and everybody have a great day.